Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kirsten Martzi, and I'm the Manager of Education and Community Engagement Programs at Brattleboro Museum and Art Center. We're pleased to have you here tonight with us for this artist talk and artist and curator conversation with Natalie Frank and Elissa Watters. This program is presented in conjunction with Natalie's exhibit Painting with Paper, which is on view through February 13th at the Brattleboro Museum and Art Center. We are offering this program as a free offering to our community, and we're so glad you're here with us. If you're interested in donating, we would really appreciate your support so that we can continue to offer free programming like this. You can do that at brattleboromuseum.org/support. We are going to have a conversation with Curator Elissa Watters and artist Natalie Frank, followed by a Q&A with all of you. So if you have questions, you're welcome to ask those at any time during the talk. And you can do that using the Q&A function if you're here with us on Zoom. And if you're here on Facebook, you can ask questions in the comments there, and we'll keep an eye on that too. You're welcome to ask questions at any time, but we'll get to them at the end. So if you ask questions throughout the program, just know that we'll keep an eye on that, and we'll get to those during the Q&A portion of the talk. So we're so thrilled to have Natalie and Elissa here with us tonight. We've loved having Natalie's show at our museum these past several months. It's such a delight to see. I'm the education manager, so I get to see groups and children interact with the exhibit and respond to it. The medium is so unusual, painting with paper, and then the content is so engaging, and it really draws people in, and it's so easy to connect with, and to just the paintings just reveal more and more the more time you spend with them. So I'm really looking forward to hearing their conversation and learning more about the show, as I'm sure you are too. With that, I think I'll invite Elissa and Natalie to join me. So if you could both turn on your microphones, and I'll turn it over to Elissa. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. And hello, Natalie.
Hi.
It's great to see you, and it's great to be on this program with you. I'm so looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you.
So to our audience, I know that some of you may have seen the show, some of you might not have seen it, or at least not yet. So I just wanted to show an installation shot and give a little bit of background, and then quickly turn it over to Natalie, and we'll kind of ask some questions and have a conversation about these works. But let me share my screen really quickly. There we go. So this is just one installation shot from the exhibition at BMAC, and these are just two of the works in the show, but this is part of Natalie's new relatively new body of work entitled Women with Animals. And we'll kind of dive more into that title and how this work came to be shortly. But just so everyone knows, the way I came to Natalie's work was through some of her pastel drawings that surrounded a project about the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. So people might have heard of the Frog Prince or the Frog King. That originally was an 18th century fairy tale for children, but it was kind of unsanitized back in the days. I mean, I know I was reading the kind of original versions and was pretty horrified. And these pastel drawings really bring out the horrific, brutal aspects, violent aspects of those tales. Natalie, I would just be curious to kind of hear more about how you came from this series that, it was a group of 75 pastel drawings, and then you turn it into a book. Then it kind of morphed into this play where you did the set designs. Here's an image that I found. Yeah. And now then you kind of turn to paper pulp painting. I mean, I know that's not quite the right term, and we'll get into that later in the process and all that, but I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about your interest in women and depictions of women, how it's morphed, and how you came to the paper pulp paintings from the Brothers Grimm and some of your earlier projects.
Absolutely, and thank you so much. Elissa had been the curator at Yale of drawing, our assistant curator of drawing. And we had such a good time talking, and I'm so glad that we can continue that conversation. The Grimms I came to the Grimms sort of by chance. A mentor, artist friend of mine, Paula Rigo, suggested that I look at them, and she had worked a lot with fairy tales and said she wasn't going to get around to drawing them, but that I should. And I had never made a concerted group of drawings before. And so the first book I ordered was Jack Sipes' translations, and just fell in love with the stories. And so up until that time and throughout, I've been painting primarily. I've been a painter in oil paint, and I started this kind of practice of drawing kind of in secret. And once I amassed quite a bit, I invited Claire Gilman from the Drawing Center over to see the work, and thus began a show and conversation with Claire at the Drawing Center in New York that ended up traveling to the Blanton and the Kentucky Art Museum. And I fell in love with these stories that all originated with women. And when you speak about fairy tales, there are really no originals, because they all morphed through the centuries and were passed down by women as kind of vehicles to talk about their life and concerns and desires. And I was really drawn to the source material of these stories and how they could reflect women at various times. And so the Brothers Grimm were working in the 19th century. So it was 1812 to 1857. They were collecting stories and changing them for poetics by and from women, and then disseminated. And they were never intended for children. But I was really interested, and I've kind of followed this theme throughout the books that have followed, and fairy tale projects that have followed the Brothers Grimm, and in one erotic novel, The Story of O, that I drew, of kind of what women's stories are, what they look like, who their companions are, how they kind of get and or take power and use it to transform themselves. And so when I started working at Dujournay, maybe it was 6-7 years ago, I was a workspace resident and just kind of had heard about the program, had never painted with paper pulp before, but was really intrigued and applied. And they take 4 artists every year. I fell in love with pulp paper painting, and we can talk more about kind of what that is in the medium, because it's really surreal. But I knew when I set out to make, and every body of work I've done at Dujournay have been women with animals. Animals in fairy tales were female companions, and they often represented kind of an outside source of transformation that would either provoke the woman to transform into another version of herself, or the women would actually transform into animals. So sometimes they were falling in love with a prince who transformed into a bird and then back into a prince, or sometimes the woman became the snake herself. And so I thought of, these portraits of women with their, almost like their kind of animal companions on their shoulders. And I think in many of the portraits, the animals and women share facial characteristics, and they start to look like, they say, you look like your dog, that they might look like their animal. So the flamingo, the first slide, is maybe a good indication, where her hot pink kind of eyelids and mouth are echoed by the flamingo that's also echoing the arc of her body.
I love how you work with color in these. And I know when we get to process, we'll talk more about the kind of marbling effect and the interlacing of the colors. But just since you've mentioned kind of women and animals and the relationship between the two, transformations, where did your female subjects for this project come from? Are they imaginary? Are they based on real women? And likewise, kind of how do you choose the animals?
Things seem really clear to me that are perhaps embarrassing or surprising, but when I found a group of women, and then I would look at them, and I would either take photographs of people that I know or find source imagery online. And when I found these women, and there was something about them that was evocative for me. And the minute I looked at them, I knew what kind of animal they were. It just seemed very clear that she was a flamingo. So I there she is with the flamingo.
Wow. So when you were working in the studio, and just to give everyone a little bit of background, Dieudonné is this organization that's been around since I think the 1980s. And they've been kind of facilitating artists making paper pulp, quote unquote paintings since then. And so Natalie, you mentioned you were a resident, I believe that was in 2015, and then you received a grant in 2019 to go back, and that's when you made this series, although I think COVID kind of got in the way, and so the timing shifted a little bit, if I remember correctly. Exactly. But it's, from what I hear, it's an amazing space, and here's one picture that I think you sent me at one point. So could you kind of talk us through your process? And one of the things that kind of sparked this for me, or why I wanted to move into this now, is because you mentioned working from actual women and images of women. Do you bring those images into the studio, into Dieudonné, when you're doing that work? How does the whole process work? Can you kind of take us through it?
Sure. So Dieudonné, first of all, they make handmade paper. And so artists come and work, and so many artists amazing artists have been through there, a lot of my heroes. And it's not just paper pulp painting. You can cast paper, there are like so many things you can do with handmade paper. I just gravitated towards paper pulp painting. And what I think you also can't see in the studio, which is really interesting, is that it's a full wet studio. So there are drains on the floor, and most people wear rubber boots and rubber coveralls. But I go in and I'm really like draconian about it and serious about it. So it's like 12-hour days. I don't wear the rubber because I want to be free to move and run around, and every like delicate motion is recorded in paper pulp. And so by hour 1, I'm sopping wet, and you just kind of stay that way, hunched over these carts, which are on rollers, with wood panels, with metal sheets, with blankets, with paper pulp that has been pulled by a master paper maker on top. And I work with Amy Jacobs, who's an incredible artist. And so I come in the studio, and we've already discussed, she knows what pigmented paper pulps I'm fond of. So all the cups of paper pulp you can see to my left, and then she pulls sheets, which you can see the middle picture of the red rectangle. She pulls those sheets, which are just formed paper pulp kind of impressions that have been pulled out of a vat with a decal box with a screen on it. And she's hand pigmented all of the paper pulp. And so I use 3 types of paper pulp, primarily 2, linen and cotton. And so Amy, in advance, the week before, has beaten all of this paper pulp in a beater, in a washing machine, into fine little particles, and then hand pigmented everything. So not only the base sheets, but every vat of, you can see there are like 100 to my side that I have to work with, which are basically my paints. It's only linen paper pulp that's been finely beaten and then hand pigmented. So there's no paint ever involved. And then I use spoons. There's this little tool I'm very fond of that's like a spoon meets a fork with a flat, it looks like a shovel. It's about that big. I love that because you can really control, you can mix the paper pulp in a cup or a large kind of bowl, and then transfer it onto the surface of the blanket without moving the paper pulp. So unlike paint, the paper pulp, because it's just paper, does not absorb and form a new color. It forms a new color optically by mixing the paper pulp, not kind of becoming a new product. So spoons, brushes, it's such a difficult process because it's like painting with wet Kleenex on wet Kleenex. And the moment you touch the surface with even a brush, it indents it. And so you have to use the gentlest kind of like caress the top of the paper, and it's all additive. So you're not, again, mixing paint, you're layering. So it's a really different way of thinking, and colors mix differently, where, you would mix red and white in oil paint and you might get like if you used an alizarin crimson and a lead white, you would get kind of a pinkish. In this, you would just get a lighter red. So it's layering and layering and layering. And then there are two different additives you can use, almost like a medium that will make the paper pulp more or less transparent. The one I like using is called methyl cellulose, and it's kind of like rotting plant material. And by day 3, it smells like a sewer in there and you're wet. But it's all part of the fun. And it actually functions, you can see on the detail shot, if you mix it with white, it makes the paint really akin to oil paint and almost like lead white, which is transparent, which I've always used to paint. So to get things like her eyelash, that little black line, I would take the end, not the brush part of a brush, but the end, like the tip of the brush, the wooden part, dip it into black paper pulp and just like drop it onto the surface.
It's so fascinating to hear you describe the process, because I've made paper poorly before, but I have made paper, but I had not known about kind of paper pulp, quote unquote, painting, as you described, as you said, this isn't paint. This is literally just pigmented, paper pulp. But it's so interesting to hear you talk about using these, like basically what you use to make paper to actually make images, as opposed to the actual paper itself. You work on top of a base sheet, to build up an image using, what we usually use to just make the paper itself. So it's so interesting that you're like building these layers of paper pulp to make these images that really do in many ways resemble paintings when you're looking at them from the outside, but they have this texture that's different. And the detail, sort of does it justice, but not really. You have to see it in person, but the texture that you're able to get, I'm wondering, you describe this medium as like very fragile. And so I'm wondering, when you're paying attention to texture in the studio, what are you going for? What do you think the texture adds to the images ultimately?
I mean, first of all, the parts that are going off the rectangle are in the process of painting. If I decide I want to extend past that rectangle, I have to use cotton pulp and then a blotting sheet and basically create a new piece of paper that's adhered to the base sheet. So you stop and you kind of build it out, and you can tear it with your finger and you can cut it with a spoon. And once that's built out, it's more of a canvas, and then you can put the linen pulp on top. And then I should say after that, and you can work on these for about 3 days. I do generally 2 concurrent weeks, and do usually 2 a day, which is really pushing it. But after 3 days, they go into a press, like a massive paper press. And then they go into a drying system where they dry for like a week or 2. And then the paper maker removes them because they're adhered to blankets, and removes them from the blankets, oftentimes with a tweezer. So it's really, you're really aware that it's paper. And when you talk about the surface, it's like handmade paper. They're bumpy and wavy, and they're not flat, but they're sculptural in a way. There isn't a tremendous amount of depth, but maybe half an inch of depth. I mean, you can see how the image is taped to the wall and it's protruding from the wall. But there's something about the paper itself that's really beautiful and compelling.
Yeah, they're amazing. So I just wanted to you're talking about this process, and the question I really have are like, you've kind of described this a little bit, but if you could highlight the challenges and the advantages of working in this medium. And I just I was reading another interview with you, and you said, there are freedoms inherent in this media which I had never encountered. There's an unusual ability to make marks and form with intense fluidity. And I think you've described that kind of fluidity a little bit, but I was just wondering if you could talk just like a moment more about the challenges of working in this medium and also the advantages of it.
Yeah, it's a really good question because there's nothing else really like it. Some of the challenges, if you touch the surface too hard, it tears. You can try to repair it. You may or may not be successful. If you spill something, oftentimes I'm working and I have 30 cups and vats like jerry-rigged around the actual paper pulp painting. If you spill something, it's like the image is gone. There's obviously no wiping away. There's no fixing something. If you really mess something up, you just pour a vat of paper pulp on top of it, the water drains out and the image is gone. And it's very unforgiving. So whatever you put down, even if you don't see it as you're working, it still exists in that memory of the paper pulp. And when it's dry, will come out. And, you know, it's interesting, the paper pulp, I'd say one really wonderful thing that I really appreciate because I love color is that the color is maintained from when you're working and it's wet to when it's dry and it comes out of the press. It really holds its color. You know, for instance, I also work in gouache and that fades a little bit once it's dry, but this retains a vividness of color that's really special. And so because of that, the surfaces, because I'm pouring and things are just very loose, and it's almost like, for me, it's been a combination of like the best parts of my drawing, which I feel are looser and more spontaneous, and the things that I really enjoy in painting, which are rendering portraiture of women. So it's this kind of wonderful combination. And I've been thinking about paper pulp a lot in the studio because I've started making 9-foot paintings again. And I've been pouring acrylic and mixing it in a way that mimics exactly what I do with paper pulp. And combining that with areas of gouache and oil paint of very rendered figures. So it's paper pulp for me helped me figure out really how to marry my painting and drawing, or the best parts of my painting and drawing, I think.
That's so fascinating to hear you talk about how one process influenced you and working with other materials. I mean, I find that so often with artists who kind of venture into printmaking, for example, they so often say that it influenced their painting practice or drawing practice or whatever. It's like so fascinating how different materials can work in different ways. But if you know how they work, you can kind of go for similar effects or apply similar techniques in different media. So just kind of looking at a couple of the works that are in the show, some of my favorites. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the juxtapositions that are often brought up when talking about your work. You know, often there's a contrast made between the wild and the tame, the natural and the artificial, the beautiful and the grotesque. And these are like juxtapositions that come up with, kind of came up with your Brothers Grimm drawings, but also I think apply to this series. And I was wondering if you could talk through a little bit what these juxtapositions mean to you, how they're working here, and what they're kind of saying, what, you know, having these contrasts kind of says.
Yeah, I think in my work, I've always, whether it's in fairy tales or erotica or in painting, I've always tried to show women as they are, as they feel, as I feel. And so I think women have all of these contradictions, and thus there they are. And for me, it's really kind of that simple. It's how I see the world, and it's how I paint and draw, and it's always how I've done it. And I think it's so innate that it's not something I'm conscious of. So when I hear someone say, you know, your art is terrifying, or it's grotesque, or I almost can't even understand what they're talking about, because it's just the lens with which I see the world. I would say what I really appreciate about fairy tales is the unsanitized fairy tales is that they do embody, like I was saying, all of these contradictions about how it feels to be a woman. So, you know, Little Red Riding Hood was made to talk about, you know, what life would be like for a woman who went into the forest unattended, and that she may be attacked, or in some of the earlier versions, the wolf was cross-dressing and wearing grandma's underwear, and Little Red Riding Hood, instead of being devoured by the wolf, did a striptease for him. And so I like this. I think it's who I am as a person. I have this sense of humor. Maybe it's something relating to the Southern Gothic. I'm from the South. I've always been drawn to magic realism and storytelling, and probably some of that comes from where I was raised. But I think I've always looked at literature for inspiration, and for some reason, showing complicated images of women is kind of de rigueur in literature, but in art, it's, you know, still a scandal. When I had my Story of O show, you know, it was censored and it had to be moved to a different gallery. And I was really struck that a book from the 1950s that was written in French and that talked about sex positive feminism could still make waves. So I guess I would say that I hope my work does agitate a little bit and make the viewer ask questions about representation and female complexity.
Have you seen receptions of your work and even your own approach to your work shift in response to the Me Too movement? This is a question that's, I know I'm kind of throwing at you. I didn't, I didn't tell you I was going to throw this one at you, but I've been thinking about it a lot. And I know that, you know, your work has been censored, and there's also a, you know, there were so many critical, like positive critical reviews of your work, but there's also, you know, there is some hesitancy by certain people. And I'm just wondering if you've seen the reception shift at all in recent years.
I think, you know, I took the backlash by that one female dealer as a really positive sign, actually, that, like I said, art could still agitate and that people were being provoked, or she was being provoked. No one else seemed to be provoked. Has the reception changed? I mean, I wrote a piece at the beginning of Me Too about my kind of long experience of sexual harassment in the art world. And I think, if anything, through my work and writing, and I've continued to write for books and short essays, that I'm kind of finding a stronger voice in my work and maybe in myself. And I think putting it out there, whether it's in writing or in the work that I make, has been a really kind of positive feedback cycle. And so now, you know, when I started working with books and the Brothers Grimm, I didn't actually know that the stories began with women. I learned that when I started to read, but now I'm seeking out projects like the Story of O, or my most recent book on Madame Delnoy, who was the first feminist fairy teller in history, who invented the word fairy tale, that are archly feminist. And the paintings I'm making and the drawings I'm making are all much more pointed and purposeful in this way. And I don't really ever think about feedback for better or worse. I think about what I really want to be doing in the work and how to make that clear.
I think the work it's so powerful and it speaks for itself. And I think, you know, it is feminist. And I mean, I would call it feminist. I think you would probably call it feminist. But it also, you know, kind of speaks to human experience more broadly. You know, none of us, like women or men, or, you know, however you identify, like none of us are simply one thing. We're all, you know, we all contain these juxtapositions or inconsistencies. Yeah. So I think the work really kind of speaks to that. And in some ways, I mean, I love your drawings from the Brothers Grimm series. But I think that this body of work, Women and Animals, in some ways it kind of, at least to me, it kind of works a little bit differently. There's a sort of companionship that is so apparent in these works that I didn't see as much in the Brothers Grimm because of the violence. And in these works, I don't feel the kind of violence the same way. I mean, obviously, you know, it's still part of this feminist discourse, but it feels like it's really representations of women as kind of carrying companions, and just individuals in the world. And so in that sense, I find that these images just work a little bit differently than the Brothers Grimm, not in a better or worse way, just differently. And I just find them really interesting. So I'm wondering, you mentioned earlier, before we kind of went on the Zoom talk, you mentioned that you're going back to Hoffman's, you're now working with Hoffman's tales.
Hoffman, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about just the shift from the paper pulp painting back into the fairy tale realm.
Yeah, it's been interesting. Something to your point, I think the distinction between the Grimm's drawings, which were not, I don't even think of them as violent. I just think of them as capturing daily life for women. But when there is violence, I think when I think about these portraits, the violence is in the hand and the surface of the paper pulp. There's so much physical agitation that's required, and you can see it in the layering of the paper pulp itself, that there doesn't need to be another layer of storytelling. And I find that when I work from literature, I do two types of drawings, one that is portraiture, sometimes with a companion, and one that are more constructed literary narrative scenes. And so this, I think, does come from some of the images, like all fur. There's an image of a blonde woman in a red smock kind of turning into an animal, a lion. And there's another image, the ungrateful son of a woman turning into a toad. But there is I think you're really right to say there's a kind of sensitivity and loving quality in these, that in the when I'm drawing literature, it's not always as apparent. And I think that's because I'm working from someone else's narratives, and I'm putting myself obviously in the drawings, but they're really in service to another storyteller. And so the book on E.T.A. Hoffman will come out, who knows now with COVID, but probably in about a year and a half, with Yale Press, and it'll be 5 of Hoffman's tales. And Karen Russell, which we're really excited about, is writing a preface, who's one of my favorite writers, and Jack Sipes, who I've been working with, is doing new translations and then writing an introduction. And I'm working with Marion Banshees, and we're doing a book that'll be the size of the Grimm, so it'll be a big coffee table book, about 380 pages, marginalia on every page, and then 35 large drawings. And he's known for doing the Nutcracker and the Sandman, are 2 of his most famous tales. And so those will be included. But they're quite magic realist and dark, and there's a lot of also animal human kind of transformations. And he's really interesting because he was the biggest influence on Edgar Allan Poe, and Hoffman is credited with inventing the detective story and creating the idea of the double or the doppelganger in literature. So throughout the book, all of the marginalia will be doubled. So it'll look like these surreal kind of Rorschach frames on the page.
And in terms of scale, how's it been to go from the paper pulp drawings, which are not small, but but kind of table size, to I think you mentioned that the paintings you're working on now are like 9 feet, huge in scale.
Yeah.
How has that shift been?
It's really fun. I mean, it's, I get to pour paper pulp at 3 feet at Dieudonné, but doing it at 9 feet, it's like, my arms are wide open. It's really, and it's, I've been working on this painting for a couple weeks, 2 weeks maybe, and I get home at night and I'm sore. And I also feel sore after I leave Dieudonné, also faint and hungry and wet, but this is like real aerobic activity. Also because pouring acrylic like paper pulp, it's like going everywhere, you're trying to control it. you kind of have to babysit it for 4 hours to go see where it's moving. So it's a little different, but it's been bringing me a lot of joy to kind of channel this Dieudonné paper pulp painting in acrylic and gouache and oil. And so.
Are you also working horizontally in the current paintings?
Yes, I have them. When you pour, you have to leave them on the floor for 2 days. So I usually take an image, I look at it, or I have it upright, and then I'm constantly going back and forth between having them upright and then having to pour on the floor. And then of course you're mixing it with medium, whereas at Dieudonné, you kind of know what you're getting because you can look at the paper pulp. But with the painting, you're mixing this white medium and everything becomes whited out. And it, though like working with paper pulp, the medium does make it thinner, but you really have no sense of how transparent it's going to be until the next day when you walk in and you see, you know, is it like green? Is it light green? Is it dark green? Is it, who knows? So.
Well, that sounds like an amazing, an amazing series. I'm so excited that you're going back to the fairy tales, because when you were talking about kind of oral narratives and just storytelling earlier, it's so interesting how you can turn a story into a single image or a couple of images, which is what, you know, you did in the Brothers Grimm. And it's interesting because sometimes you'll use that kind of what I think of as sort of a classic motif where the same figure appears multiple times in the same image. And I just think it's such a powerful device, and so interesting to kind of see how a single figure can kind of morph throughout a single image. And I wonder if viewers today, if we're kind of trained the same way to pick up on that, to kind of pick up that it's the same figure that's recurring in a single image, or if it's something that we kind of have to work to decipher. But either way, I mean, I think the work of deciphering it is part of its power as well.
Yeah. And I think we still look at comic book strips and seriality, so it's understandable. But when I'm at Dieudonné, I'm really, like, I've picked all my images beforehand. I have a very clear sense, because there's no time to be wasted, of what I'll be doing and how the work functions as a group. And so when I'm there, it's almost a matter of just bringing all the people to life that I have. And I work from images off my phone, which is why in the image you shown that you can see me looking at my phone. I'm not like checking my email. So it's a fun process. It's like raising the dead, you know.
I know someone was asking for an image. I know I don't have any images of the current work. I don't know if you have any. You can really pull up.
Maybe on my Instagram there's some. If you do Natalie Frank, but they're all flat. I'm not quite at the point of unveiling yet because I'm still experimenting.
Well, we'll leave everybody in suspense for the time being. Maybe we should open it up to questions and answers from the audience, or questions from the audience, answers from Natalie.
Yeah, this has been fascinating. Thank you so much. For those of you with us on Zoom, again, you can put your questions in the Q&A box, and on Facebook, you can use the chat function. And we've already got questions coming in, so I'll get started. We have a couple questions about process. Rhiannon asks, what drew you to execute the paper paintings instead of oil paint? And she's also a painter, and she's actually our greeter at the museum. So thank you for joining us, Rhiannon.
Thank you.
And then I'll ask this question with another one. Keegan asks, would you say this is closer to sculpting than painting? So a couple process questions to think about. Okay, thank you for your questions. I think it's definitely the closest I've come to like successful painting that I've ever done. For me, it feels much more successful than straight oil painting, just for me. So definitely painting. And the other question was, remind me, sorry. The question about a sculpture, is that? The other one. the other one was oil painting versus the paper pulp painting.
Oh, well, this was supported by a Pollock Krasner grant, and I wanted to go into Dieudonné, and I wanted to make these in paper pulp painting because there is this kind of freedom and looseness that I'm able to get in paper pulp painting that I haven't yet been able to achieve in painting in my studio. But I think that's changing now that I'm using materials that are like paper pulp painting.
That's great. Yeah, I was thinking about, as you were talking about that, kind of the fluidity of your work, and thinking about that in my experience with the pieces. And one of the things that I love most is the expansion beyond the frame, and how I kind of can imagine you in the studio, like pouring the paper pulp and kind of, you know, being flexible with where it goes, and letting the material lead you in a way.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a nice, for someone who's really type A, it's like a really good force loss of control. And it's fun. Like the amount of time that I laugh in the studio while I'm all alone is disconcerting, but it happens quite a bit. So
that's great. Yeah, it seems like it'd be so like tactile and exciting. We have a few more questions. Someone anonymous asks about this relationship, the women and the animals and their companionship. They are wondering if you could talk about how they relate to each other, women and animals, and that choice. Is it that they're both colorful or different, being hunted or prosecuted? And then we had, oh, this is another, that's a question about something else.
Let me answer. So it's definitely no violence. It's all happiness in these paper pulp paintings. They're companions. And I was thinking about the amount of times that I've seen images of men and their hunting dogs in paintings. And I was like, you know, and I love animals. I really love dogs. And I thought, why not have portraits of women with their companions? And those companions should be animals instead of men. And not because I hate men, but just because why not? And there you go. But, you know, in the literature that I'm drawn to, a lot of the fairy tales, as I said, the women transform into animals, they transform back into women. And it's a real, if you can, Marina Warner wrote a wonderful book called From the Beast to the Blonde. And she talks about representations of women in fairy tales and in folklore, and the way that animals are a sort of proxy for this ability to shift and to transform. And what is really meant by that, you know, in the 19th century and the 17th century tales, which I just drew, was that people, women, could move up and down in society. They could go to school, they could become professionals, they could become wealthy, they could become independent. And those were all ways that they could change their life. And animals are the surrogate for these power structures.
One thing I would just say about the transformation, because just because this is something I love about the paper pulps, is the way that the animals kind of emerge out of the women in a way, just because of the nature of paper pulp and how it works, like with all the kind of bits of paper being interwoven. It's kind of, they become almost one body, which is sort of like the epitome of all companionship, right? It's like you're almost one being. So that's something I really love about the paper pulp process itself, is it kind of allows you to make that connection, not just conceptually, but also literally physically in the material.
That's a great point. I haven't thought of that before, but that's so true.
I just think of that every time I see, I can share my screen, but the canaries and the fox in particular, just the way the canary, they're just like coming out of, like, there's that one that's kind of coming out of her head, or I guess there are two, but like mostly the one that we see here on the left, and then the fox and how it's so interlaced with her. And I think when you see it in person, it's even more just kind of the fox and the woman are just kind of one form.
I think we have actually one of the owners of one of those paper pulps on the Zoom with us. So thank you for attending.
And for lending.
And for lending.
Yeah, I was thinking about that, the companionship and the relationship between the women and the animals. And I've been doing a lot of school tours with your exhibit and bringing classrooms in. And we did an activity where the students drew themselves with an animal that they felt a connection to. And I had them think about, look at the paintings or the art and see how the women relate to that animal. Think how you would be with that animal. Are you holding it? Is it on your head? Is it on your shoulder? And we had so many creative expressions come out of that, like kids riding whales and Sonic the Hedgehog on the shoulder. And so when you say that there's all like love and light in these relationships, like that's just so beautifully captured and has given us a lot of joy as well.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
That's so nice.
Let's see, we have a few more questions. Just scrolling through. Dave asks if you could talk a little bit about the woman and the crow.
Oh, yes. I think its new owner wants to hear about the piece. It is, awesome. So it's on the right, and I actually made her first, and then I recently had a show at Lyles and King in Salon 94, and at Lyles and King I made these large wall vinyls. And I decided, she was a woman who definitely with that collar needed a crow, but then I thought, who would she be in real life? And that she would be a dominatrix. So the wall vinyl I made from my drawings was a dominatrix with a whip and black high heels. But I thought of her as a, maybe like a cabaret vampire performer, kind of has this Weimar look to her with the black couture, almost like Dior collar, and this kind of omen of this bird that was probably going to talk, or something right out of Poe, find the telltale heart. And I wanted that eye on her that was looking so intently at the viewer to be echoed by the crow, and that kind of red paper pulp floating in white, almost hot pink, that's echoed under her eye and then above her left ear. But I wanted her gaze to be so direct that the crow was, you were immediately like, you looked first at her and then you looked at the crow and its face and it was looking away and you followed that. And it was almost this like power, this eye that like sucked you in and then told you which way to go. So a lot of when I'm doing all of, a large amount of portraits, I'm thinking about how I'm gonna lead the viewer to the woman, to the story of the picture. And this one was actually one of my favorites from the series, and it felt like one of the more intense, confrontational, not in a bad way, but just in a very like, I kind of want to eat you kind of way. Very direct, consuming.
Natalie, I have to say, sorry, like struggling with Zoom for a second. But I have to say, when I was kind of coming up with the installation design for the show, the woman with crow is also one of my favorites. And I realized that it couldn't be with other pieces on the wall. I mean, I'm sure it could be, maybe in a bigger gallery, it could be, but that gaze is so intense that it kind of needed its own wall.
Yeah.
But but it's so great. And it's so great in part because, I mean, the red in the background, and as you said, above her ear, under her eye, and then in the crow, and it kind of ties it all together. And you're so amazing with color. I mean, your eye for color is incredible. And it always just, ties the compositions together. But there was one more thing I wanted to say about color. Now I'm forgetting. But yeah, no, that piece needed its own. Oh, I know what it said. It wasn't about color. It was also about expressions, that every single woman has her own expression. And so that's like another way in which I feel like you're giving each woman her own personality. And it really comes through every single time.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd say the woman with the crow I really thought of as a self-portrait. There's always one in a series, and that's the one that I was like, I see you.
That's great. I agree about each woman having their own personality or their own gaze and expression. And when I talk with groups in there and I also brought this slideshow to some senior homes, and people don't agree on what the women are feeling and what the expression is. And I think that just speaks to the complexity of the images and of the women and of these characters that you've created.
What were some of the reactions of some of the people that you brought it to, the older
Oh, they're great. So they thought, oh, what happened to her? Who got in her way? That would be the woman in the crowd.
Probably your husband.
Yeah. And then like some of them would, oh, that's so sad. Maybe the woman is overcoming something, or there's strength and ferocity. And so they really were drawn, and because I was showing them a slideshow, we could zoom in and look closely, and they were really drawn to all of the colors and just that kind of effect of the more you look, the more you see with these pieces. And they're not like, they're beautiful, but they're not beautiful, if you know what I mean. Like they're compelling, and they're kind of strange and unsettling. So I think that there was a lot of conversation about, like, do we like this? Do we not like this? So yeah. It was great show to talk about with folks. I've really enjoyed it.
I love it. Thank you.
Yeah. We have a few more questions we want to get to, and I know it's getting towards 8 o'clock, so we have if you're interested in asking more questions after the talk, you can always email us at info@brattleboromuseum.org, and we'll pass your question along to Natalie and to Elissa. So I'm just going to ask a couple more questions, and we'll save those that we haven't answered and make sure that they get to Natalie and Elissa. So let me just pick one. So Rhiannon asked if you could speak more to your personal experience of creating the paper pulp images, connection to the imagery and the unforgiving process, relinquishing control. Do you feel this lack of control links to the women of history of women and women's rights? So thinking about control and relinquishing control.
I think it's really in the moment, it's kind of, actually, I think of it more as like a playfulness. Like the pulp paper painting has its own voice, and it's talking back at me, and I have to respond. So no, I don't. I think that may be more complexity than what's there. It's really just a physicality issue.
That makes sense.
Question. It's really nice. Yeah.
I also think about when I take groups through to the museum generally, there's like what the artist put into it and the artist's intent, and then there's also what the viewer comes away with, and that interaction between the piece. So I think if that's something that you want to bring away from it, then that's great too.
Definitely.
Let's see. I'll do one more.
I'm really interested in the question. Someone asked, have you ever destroyed your work on purpose? And I actually don't know the answer to that, Natalie. Have you?
Of course. I'm always calling Rona Hoffman, and I'm like, take a hammer, destroy, all your inventory. She's like, oh God, Natalie. Yeah. It literally has to leave the studio so I don't destroy it. That happens a lot. A lot.
What is generally why do you generally have that kind of change of reaction? Like maybe it differs.
I think I'm pretty brutal, and if it's not working, then it's destroyed. or if I can't save it. In the pulp paper painting, it's easy. You just pour a vat of pulp over it and it's gone. So you're not like tearing something up, but it's, you know, you can't be precious about these things. It's not, you know, it's not a journal entry. It's going to go out and live in the world. And if you can't be proud of your children, you've got to stay in the closet, you know?
It's so interesting that you say that, because I was reading something, an interview with you, and you mentioned in that interview that you don't really have, like, you're always producing, and if you can't produce for maybe a day, then you read a book or something, but then by the next day you're back in the studio. And I thought that was so interesting, because I don't know if I don't think that's necessarily the case for all artists, that they just feel like they can constantly produce, they never get stuck. So it's interesting to hear you know, that that's your experience, but at the same time, you know, you're obviously very critical of your work, and that you could destroy something that you put so much time and effort in. I mean, I know artists do it all the time, but
you throw away, you know, socks before you burn them. No, but I think for, you know, in all seriousness, I think for a long time while I was painting in oil, I was really frustrated, and I didn't feel that things were actually flowing. And now, and drawing unlocks something, and literature unlocks something. And now it's just, you know, if I'm not having fun and it's not bringing me joy, why do it every day? And I think it shows in the work. And I don't work weekends. And that's how I take usually a month, try to take a month off a year. But I do work a lot, but I love it. So it's like, there's so much I want to do, and there are only so many years I get to be alive, that, you know. So.
Well, we're really grateful for all that you've done and continue to do, Natalie, and excited to see what you do next in this book project and these 9-foot acrylic paintings. Yeah, it's been wonderful to have your exhibit at the museum, and thank you to Elissa for curating, and thanks to you both for joining us for this talk. This talk has been recorded and will be available on our website at brattleboromuseum.org under the programs tab. So it'll be there in a couple days. You can also donate at our website at brattleboromuseum.org/support if you enjoyed this program. Again, we didn't get to all the questions, but I've have record of them all, and I'll make sure that we get the questions to Natalie and Elissa. I think that's it. Remember to come see the show. It's up through February 13th. And it's just amazing. Come more than once. Admission is pay as you wish. We're open Wednesday to Sunday, 10 to 4. So thank you both so much, and I hope you all have a great evening.
Thank you so much. It's been, yeah, a real honor to have the show at your museum, and Elissa for curating this wonderful exhibition. I'm forever grateful. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Brattleboro, for the opportunity. Thank you, Natalie, for everything. And thank you to everyone who joined us tonight.
Yeah.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Bye.